10 of the UK population in hospital. The Financial Times addresses the global financial impact of COVID-19 as well as the political ramifications. While the Eye reports the virus has resulted in the worst week for the markets since 2008. The Times headline about COVID-19 is Emergency Laws to Help Fight Against Coronavirus, alongside a photograph of Greta Thunberg at today's so-called school strike protest in Bristol. The Guardian reports on how the Red Cross is helping the NHS tackle the outbreak. The Daily Express is calling COVID-19 a killer virus with a photo of the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. And according to the Daily Star, it's not only humans who can get COVID-19, but canines as well. So, Polly Mackenzie and Alex Dean, hello to both of you. So, coronavirus really dominating the headlines. You've picked out the Daily Telegraph, which is a paper that normally has a lot of different stories on its front page, but they're all related to the virus tomorrow, aren't they?
And of course, times like this one says, we are not virologists and we are not experts on what we're looking at, and we might as well to say wash your hands for as long as it takes to sing happy birthday twice, preferably in your head if you're in a public lavatory rather than out loud. It'd be annoying. But given that we're looking at the papers, the Telegraph does say some pretty unpleasant things about the extent of planning we might have to go through as a country if at the upper end of infection and so-called pandemic rates, where we might have to use as public morgues and so forth. So it's not a pleasant read on the front of the Telegraph today. One does note that we're at a sum total of 20 cases in the UK so far, but it is right that our authorities make plans for things being very bad and seek to put contingencies in place. And I have to say, actually, one of the things I've noticed in the press over the last few days has been criticism of the government for not being forthcoming enough. Sometimes government not talking to you about things doesn't mean it's not thinking about things. Sometimes government's making planning and hoping not to engender panic. And so now we're finally seeing some of the plans for if this got really bad. But I think people should be reassured that government is thinking about it.
What do you make of the way that this is being reported on the front of the Telegraph, for example? Outbreak could leave 1 in 10 in hospital. Presumably, we're talking worst case scenario, and we don't know what kind of scenario we're looking at the moment. Is this helpful that people feel reassured that even if the worst happens, there are plans afoot? Or do you think it worries people?
I think the 1 in 10 figure is sort of deeply alarming and probably unhelpful, because 1 in 10 people can't be in hospital. We don't have enough hospitals to put 7 million people in hospital. I think the idea is that if this became an endemic disease which came back every year like flu does, then about 1 in 10 of the people who get it would end up in hospital, because we know that the death rate is quite low, and yet there is quite a large number of people, particularly elderly people, who will require intensive hospital treatment. And so it's not 1 in 10 all at the same time. It is 1 in 10 over the course of the progress of the illness.
Well, the number has been cited in plenty of places being higher than 1 in 10. Some places have got it at 1 in 5. So this is actually not the most alarming of the numbers that are being bandied about. It depends, I think, in part, what one considers hospital to be. If what you mean is, requisitioned gymnasiums and halls in which people are being kept for some time, perhaps on a minimum care or a drip or something, that's one thing. If you mean actual hospitalisation where people require active nursing and monitoring, there's no doubt Polly's right, the system would fall over if people are taking that kind of treatment all in one go. But of course, one of the other things we think about is all those people who don't require hospitalisation but are not economically active. And we get into that through some of the other papers, but there'll be lots of people who are asked to go home or not come into the city or not go to their workplace, and that will have enormous ramifications, even if they're only very slightly poorly. That is to say, far less poorly than they would be the normal flu.
And we'll come on to the impact on the economy and the markets a little bit later, but let's move on to the front page of the Times next, because they are looking ahead and suggesting that some new measures may come into place to allow local authorities, I think it is, and other public areas of the public sector more powers to try to put in measures to control things.
Yeah, so they're talking about a range of measures. It's not clear whether they mean new laws or simply new regulations under existing laws. We already have a Civil Contingencies Act, which allows the government in a state of emergency to take quite sweeping powers. what they're doing is putting out some briefing about the kinds of things they're considering. For example, allowing teachers to take on more than 30 children in a class, so that if some of the teachers are out being isolated, as Alex was talking about, the schools can still stay open. Or allowing lorry drivers to work more than 56 hours a week, which is the current limit, so that supplies don't run up if there's a shortage of lorry drivers. Obviously, all of those things come with their own challenges. Lorry drivers falling asleep at the wheel and, crashing on the M4 doesn't exactly resolve the problem. Nevertheless, as Alex says, I think it's right that the government considers all of the options, draws up plans, whether they are plans for a public morgue on the top of Hyde Park, which is obviously very much at the worst case scenario end of it, or simply plans for how much advertising you do about the hand washing and the happy birthday.
I'm not being contrarian for being contrary's sake, and indeed I started by saying government should make plans and have contingencies in place. On the other hand, we must of course always be aware that in emergencies sometimes governments pass laws that are stringent, sometimes overly stringent, and ought probably to be repealed as soon as possible. We had, it's not a flippant example I hate, pub closures were visited upon us, closing hours during the war, and remained with us for decades afterwards. Various restrictions on freedom of movement were put in place. Indeed, the requirement for a passport and ID came into the UK during the war years, and we had very vigorous discussions afterwards about whether we should require people to have identification, finally resolved, rightly in my view, by not requiring people to carry ID around relatively recently. If we do need emergency laws, they should be closely examined, notwithstanding the fact that there is an emergency in place, and they should be repealed as soon as possible once the emergency is passed.
And let's take in the Daily Mail as well, because that's very much the focus of their front page. But also, just before we move on, they have also mentioned the fact that the first British victim, the first Briton to die, was revealed today, someone who'd been on the cruise ship in Asia, and also the first person to pick up the disease here, so someone who had, it was transmitted in this country. That's the first time that's happened, apparently. So that's notable developments on the disease today. But let's move on and go to the Daily Mirror next. And this comes back to the point that you were making earlier, Alex, about the criticism on the government on whether or not they were doing enough or being seen to do enough. So their headline here is "Wage War on Virus," and this seems to be George Osborne who's suggesting that, or suggesting a course of action for the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, George Osborne sent out a tweet earlier today saying that government should adopt this war footing. And he's, of course, not talking about soldiers in the street. He's proposing daily briefings, hourly calls and schedules in order to make sure the government's on top of things. Boris Johnson has been criticised for not having chaired what's called the COBRA meeting, which is basically Cabinet Office Briefing Room A, in the basement of the Cabinet Office, but called COBRA. And it is a good way to bring, in a secure environment, all of the agencies together to make sure that the efforts are coordinated. But just because they haven't chaired the meeting doesn't necessarily mean that they're not being coordinated. And I think the government does seem to be making progress. The concern I have is about, certainly I'm an employer, the clarity of the advice for employers remains pretty weak.
Well,
but also the message, sorry to cut in, but also what about the messaging of, the optics, if you like, of calling a COBRA meeting, even if meetings are going on anyway and behind closed doors?
Yeah.
Does the public need to see that it's being treated with a certain amount of seriousness? Is it about saying, don't worry, we are taking this seriously, we're in control? Do you think that matters?
I would rather government didn't indulge in that kind of pantomime. I would rather government got on and actually did things rather than thinking about staging meetings for the sake of having a meeting, or indeed in another context sending a Prime Minister for a photo op, whether it be up to the top of his wellies in a flood or in a hospital where he's getting in the way of people trying to treat those who are sick. I'd rather government actually went about the business of doing things. I mean, there is something slight that gets great slightly at the macho, COBRA, as what good fortune it was that Cabinet Office Briefing Room A happened to spell out COBRA. What a remarkable coincidence. Well, this kind of machismo of government, I think, is a shame. I'd rather government just got on with it. And as far as I can see, government is. I thought it was interesting, Jeremy Hunt's remark today, that if you were going to be in a pandemic anywhere, pandemic, of course, meaning something that's exposed to everyone at some point, you've all got the chance of catching it. There's nowhere better in provisions terms than the UK. You'd rather be in the UK than anywhere. And I think that's probably right, actually.
Do you think that's right in terms of how visible the government should be on an issue like this?
It's so hard to get the judgment right between creating panic, causing people to stockpile food, to stay away from work, to stop sending their kids to school, and to cause, collapse in the stock market, which we're already seeing, but and making sure that your preparations are perfect. They will always get it slightly wrong, and they will continue to kind of overcorrect one way or another as we go through this. I think, they're doing well at least, but I certainly would prefer some.
And let's briefly have a look at the front page of the Express, because that kind of plays into it as well. There's a picture of Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, with Boris.
They're having a meeting. You should be you're 10% more reassured.
There you go. And one of the headlines, the subheads up there, PM says crisis is top priority and great concern. That was the message he was putting out.
Yeah, and he told people how to wash their hands.
Indeed.
Well.
Let's move on to a double-page spread inside the Mail next, because this focuses on the economy side of it and the impact on shares. And it has been the worst week on the market since the financial crisis.
Since the crash. And sadly, it seems that the market's probably still got a way to go. If you think about supply chains, where in the absence of major warehousing, which is not what we use now as a structure in the just-in-time business model, things that are coming to the UK on container ships from China take about 6 weeks out of the factory to arriving on your shop shelf. Well, this really, at least we got to know about it emerging from China. It may have been existing there a little while before that, but we really got to know about the outburst some 6 weeks ago. So we'll probably this week and next week start to feel the pinch a bit on what you can physically buy. And that's the kind of thing that really does trigger concern and panic in markets when there's a shortage on some goods. Even if those goods to begin with are car parts and electronics and white goods and so forth, that people will still be concerned. The bigger thing that happens when the stock market runs like this is that the panic fuels itself, and people think to themselves, well, if the container ships are all in the wrong place and you can't get your supply chain right, that's going to have a knock-on effect to the next part of the buying chain, and that's going to have a knock-on to the next part. I might as well pull out now. And the panic can become self-fulfilling. I'm not dismissing the concerns from this condition. It may be very serious indeed, but there's a real chance that it's not as serious as people are thinking about. But nevertheless, the coronavirus does immense economic harm because of the way that people react to it.
Well, that's true. But also, in terms of just following formal advice, just not travelling in the same way, that's going to have an impact on airlines, on tourism.
So airlines have been absolutely at the forefront of the losses on the stock market, and holiday companies as well, because of precisely that, people just wanting not to travel, sometimes following government advice, sometimes not booking summer holidays, all of those kinds of choices that people are making right now. And China's already has its economy affected, not just by people's illnesses, of course, but by the fact of the containment measures.
Yeah.
You stop people from traveling, you stop people from going to work, you keep factories shut down. It has a vast effect. And I guess the challenge is that we might take enough efforts to contain this to really harm the economy that still don't actually work to prevent it becoming a pandemic.
And while you make your point, we've only got about 30 seconds, but let's just show the double-page spread in the Times while you make your point, because it's no doubt it's picked up somewhere here, because there's a lot of stories there.
There are people who have look at a story like this and say, well, why do I care about what's happening in the markets? If you've got a pension, you should really care about what's happening in the markets because your pension's invested in those kinds of funds. And it's worth noting in both these stories, they record the fact that for the first time an animal is noted with a condition of coronavirus. A dog has caught coronavirus from they think from a contaminated surface. So this story is going to get worse, and it's going to go for a while, I'm afraid.
It is, and we don't know to what extent. That's the thing, isn't it, at this stage? Okay, we're going to take a break. Lots more coming up after the break. And we're going to be talking about the Greta effect, why thousands have flocked to see the teenage climate activist today. There are plenty of other stories out there beyond coronavirus. Front page of the Times, their second story is about what Sajid Javid would have done were he still Chancellor.
Yes,
is that right?
Yeah, basically. So it's quite an extraordinary thing to have done. But of course, Sajid Javid was, I think, probably the only chancellor in the last 150 years or something. You're probably going to correct me, but who never got to deliver a budget because he wouldn't sack his advisors and so lost his job instead. He's suggesting he would have been a radical tax-cutting chancellor, aiming to get the basic rate of income tax down to 15p by the end of the Parliament. It's currently 20p, and also cutting stamp duty and a range of other things. I mean, you can argue about the details of it, but I think what's fascinating to me is that we know Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak are sort of thinking about tearing up the investment rules, wanting to be able to spend a lot more. Coronavirus is going to have an impact on the economy. That gets rid of some of their headroom. And this creates pressure in the Conservative Party. If Rishi Sunak comes out, in a couple of weeks with a budget that doesn't cut tax, Sajid Javid has opened that flank in the party of there's a different way, there's being a proper tax-cutting Conservative.
What do you make of the fact that he's done this interview? I think it's on page 2 as well.
Sure. I think on the one hand, it's kind of no harm done because everyone knows the government's activity is so curtailed by the coronavirus. It's going to be a far quieter budget than anyone had ever expected because the government's going to have to tamp down most activity in the face of a potential global pandemic. On the other hand, I cannot help but think Polly's probably right. There's slightly suspicious about a chap saying, well, here's the Thatcherite alternative. Here's what you could have won. Here's what I might have delivered to you if I was still there. He has talked a good game on tax cutting for a while, but I gently note, with all respect for someone who held that great office of state, if he wanted to deliver this budget, he could have done.
Well, he obviously felt it was a matter of principle, didn't he? That's
more important than bringing down the budget now he wants to talk to us about. Hardly.
There's also some detailed suggestions from the PM's advisor, Andrew Griffith, just above, if, for example, talking about merging tax and national insurance, which is one of those technocratic, wonky, terribly sensible things to do that will never happen.
National insurance is just another tax.
Of course it is, but they'll never do it.
Let's move on to Greta, who was in Bristol today, and there's a shot of lots of waterproofs, actually, in the crowd there. Obviously, speaking about the environment to lots of school children.
Yeah, I mean,
amongst others.
It's clear from lots of the posters and the placards that Greta is a huge inspiration to a lot of kids and teenagers, and she has achieved an enormous thing, really, to someone so young, so inexperienced, to have just burst onto the landscape. And whether it's just to do with her or the ghastly people at Extinction Rebellion, I don't know. But certainly, over the last 2 years, public opinion around how important climate change is has transformed, and that is welcome.
Sure.
Because we have to go along with the radical changes to our
I can never remember what we're supposed to think about people in this age bracket. Are they innocent darlings who must be protected at all costs in society, or are they saints who we must listen to without possible challenge? My instinct is there's something in between which says you should be in school and there's a reason you don't have the vote yet. This is someone who is distorting, I think, the political agenda quite significantly in a country which has done more to reduce our carbon footprint than the rest of the G20. Go and tell the Chinese or the Russians to reduce their pollution and see how you get on.
OK, we might bring this up again at 11:30.
Sure.
I'm sure there's plenty of other opinions to explore there, but we're out of time for now. See you very shortly. Emergency laws in war on virus. An awful lot about coronavirus on the front pages. We're going to be talking about that and lots else. The Daily Mirror leads on Boris Johnson being urged to go on a war footing to fight COVID-19. Emergency laws to combat COVID-19 are set to be a virus has resulted in the worst week for the market. Side a photograph of Greta Thunberg at today's The Daily Express is calling
catching the virus.
The front pages. You've picked out the Daily Express and their coverage to kick us off.
Yeah, and I will sympathise with the Daily Star if we didn't pick them out. But that story about canines catching the virus is repeated on some of the insides too. It does seem to be true. It's not just a human condition. The argument is made on the front of the Daily Express that there is a battle to keep us safe, and you see this theme running now through a number of the fronts, kind of war metaphors and similes and battles, and we often use these terms in medical conditions, don't we? But the Prime Minister faces a situation here, front page, with Matt Hancock having a meeting about this, of a situation where the first British person has sadly died. We've only had, not to make light of it, 20 cases in the UK so far, all related to people who've come back from Italy or have been with somebody from Italy. So thus far, the genuine health...
Except the latest case, there are question marks. They don't know.
I thought that he'd talked with someone who'd come back from Italy.
As far as I'm aware, it's not clear yet where he picked it up from, but it's thought that he contracted it in this country. But as far as I'm aware...
Yes, I thought from someone from Italy. But
it's the first version of an onward transmission within our borders, and so potentially a symbol that the containment efforts that we've made in terms of bringing people back from Italy aren't yet working. It's all complicated and difficult.
For sure. And in the front line of the battle to keep us safe, as the Express reminds us on the front, wash your hands. Wash your hands for at least 20 seconds. There is some dispute about how useful the antibacterial gels will actually be, as this is a virus. Alcohol gels are better. Hard soap is just fine.
Indeed. And so there's the Express take on it. Reporting, as you can see there, one of their headlines, PM says crisis is top priority and great concern. And to another illustration of those war metaphors on the front page of the Mirror, wage war on virus there. And the Mirror highlights some of the criticisms that's been facing the government. Labour, for example, have been saying that a COBRA meeting, there's one planned for Monday, perhaps should have happened sooner. George Osborne also giving out advice as well.
Yeah, George Osborne, obviously the former Chancellor, chose to give some advice to the government on Twitter, saying, among other things, that they should be having daily NHS briefings, regular COBRA meetings, and also that ministers should be talking on all broadcast outlets, which I think was a reference to the ongoing boycott by Number 10 of the Today programme in particular, which it seems is being lifted temporarily tomorrow, where a junior health minister will feature for the first time in several weeks on the Today programme. I've been frankly enjoying the Today programme without the ministers. It's been slightly calmer and more enjoyable. It's an odd choice for everybody to just start attacking the government. The government has a really difficult line to tread because they have to make sure that they don't stoke panic. The impact on our economy could be far larger than the impact on the health of people in Britain if this is handled badly. It's already had, as some of the papers cover, and here we see shares falling by £210 billion. So the government, perhaps they could have moved a day faster, perhaps they could have taken a day longer. They will always get it slightly wrong, and I think we should be as supportive as we can of the advice that they're giving us.
If George Osborne wanted to affect what government does, he shouldn't have flounced out of government.
OK, leaving George Osborne to one side, what about the issue of COBRA meetings? Obviously, they tend to be called when there is a crisis, what's deemed to be a crisis. Some have suggested that it should have happened sooner, not least to let the public know in a very visual way that something is being done.
People know that this is a serious situation, and I think people know that the government is taking it seriously. Meetings for meeting's sake, or for symbolic sake, to me smacks of the pantomime of symbolism in government rather than actually doing things.
Even if it offers public reassurance?
Oh, I think the government's offering public reassurance by putting measures in place and offering guidance on what we should do. Whether the government actually has a meeting in a room that may or may not be called COBRA, it's neither here nor there, putting it politely.
OK, and let's look at some of those measures that we understand are going to be put into place, because they feature on the front page of the Daily Mail tomorrow. They're talking about emergency laws which could go into place.
Yeah, they're looking at a range of measures which they could introduce, presumably not with primary legislation, but under existing legislation, the Civil Contingencies Act, which gives the government additional powers in a state of emergency. Sometimes a meeting can be useful because it's not just a symbol to the public of the status and importance of it, it's also a symbol to the system within the civil service, and it makes sure everybody is there together. But of course, you can do successful countermeasures without everybody having to be in the same room. Some of the measures they're talking about are, for example, allowing lorry drivers to work more than 56 hours a week, so that if some lorry drivers are unable to work, we don't end up with shortages. Of course, we already have the deadline of changes to our trading relationship with the EU that could affect supply chains. So lots of pressure on the haulage industry, I think.
And also measures including allowing teachers to teach perhaps more than the limit of 30, I think it is, or thereabouts, in case other teachers get ill. And there are lots of measures that could go into place regarding big groups of people, aren't there? But Chris Whitty, of course, from Public Health England, has been talking, the Chief Medical Officer has been talking about, perhaps there needs to be a discussion about the impact on society of some of these measures and whether or not they should happen.
There's a trade-off here to be had between necessary measures that seek to diminish and limit the risks to the public, and on the other hand, not allowing something to so entirely distort our way of life that it does grave harm, perhaps even more harm than the health impact would be. Without being flippant about it, and of course, very sadly, we have the news today that a British person has died from this condition. The mortality rate is very low and would seem at present not to affect those outside of quite an elderly or underlying condition type bracket with something that is much worse than the flu. I'm not playing it down. Some people will have to go to hospital, but that is not the worst possible thing to happen in health terms. And of course, people are drawing comparisons both with Spanish flu historically, which killed many more people, and Ebola much more recently, which had a much higher death rate. And you look at this and you think to yourself, should we really be cancelling all the kinds of things that we either are cancelling or talking about cancelling and allowing it to affect us that much? So it's a genuine question.
Indeed. And I'm going to bring in the Telegraph now. I'm going slightly out of your order, but only because you mentioned the number of people that might go to hospital. And the front page of the Telegraph says outbreak could leave 1 in 10 in hospital. I mean, this is presumably worst case scenario, is it? This is if we have an extreme outbreak in this country. They're talking about some of the scenarios and what might happen.
If the disease becomes basically just endemic within the United Kingdom so that everybody gets it at some point, it seems that the somewhere around 1 in 10 people will be so badly affected that they will need hospital care of some sort. As Alex said, the death rate appears to be quite low, perhaps 1 or 2%, and concentrated among elderly people or those with pre-existing lung conditions. Clearly, if 1 in 10 people in the population was in hospital simultaneously, we would that's practically 7 million people. We just simply don't have the hospital beds for that. We don't have the nurses for that. We don't have the drips. We don't have the face masks for it. But I think we have to presume that if that did happen, if that level of caseload was met, it would be over the course of time. One of the concerning features that about this disease is it seems possible that some people may catch it more than once rather than it being something that you get once and get over.
That's true. We've seen the reports of the first reinfections in China, although people are uncertain whether that was because they were only swabbing mouth and nose and perhaps it's a lower respiratory tract condition or a genuine reinfection. I think one interesting thing, given that we're talking about China and we've all mentioned the mortality rate, is that it gets harder to calculate it because of a factor that isn't mentioned in any of these front pages, which is concern about the disclosure that we're getting out from China about the conditions, and especially given that they had it first. There's been real concerns about the media lockdown that we've seen in China, closed towns and cities effectively in a way that you could never implement in the West, and people's access to free media. Even if there is nothing to hide, you were talking about impressions. It does create a deep concern when you can't access those who are being affected by these conditions. And if there is something to hide, then we may be impeding science's ability to tackle, and medicine's ability to tackle this condition. The mortality rate may in truth be higher or lower, but we don't know yet because potentially we don't know all the people who've caught this in China.
Management of information, though, is quite important as well, isn't it?
Sure.
So that you make sure that people have genuine facts and you don't spread fear.
But there's also the question, do you encourage everybody to come forward and be tested when they might have just a cough or a cold? Which then creates its own stresses and strains on the health system. But if you don't do that, lots of people will be infected, get over it, and never be part of the statistics.
Let's just bring in the Financial Times, finally, for this section, because they really, this is the Times which also talks about emergency laws, but let's see if the FT can with the Financial Times, because they talk about, obviously, the impact that we've already seen on the markets this week, the worst week for the markets since the 2008 financial crisis.
Savage week in the markets, and Standard & Poor has seen some real challenges, I think, and I think people will look at what's been going on in some of the recent moves in the market and think that doesn't actually affect me. Well, actually, if you've got a pension and it depends on trading in the markets and stocks and shares in publicly traded companies, it really does affect you. This is hundreds of billions of pounds that have been wiped off the face of value on businesses. More than 200 billion from the FTSE alone. That's British businesses or businesses in the UK. This is very significant damage, and it's, I'm afraid, going to get worse because as concerns grow about supply chains and impact on workers and populations, we have not seen the end of this.
Well, that's right. It's not just manufacturing. It's also people being told to stay at home, just not going to work. So there's all sorts of impacts.
Yeah, and impacts on the travel industry as well. It's one of the reasons why President Trump has been criticised. I think he obviously is very invested in economic growth ahead of, and the strength of the market ahead of his election in November, and I think therefore tried to talk down coronavirus and has now started talking it back up again.
And asked Vice President Pence to deal with it.
Indeed, he's in charge. Okay, we're going to take a pause. Coming up, a paramedic in your pocket, the heart implant that can talk to doctors. That's coming up after the break. Review with me tonight, the director of Demos think tank, Polly Mackenzie, and the PR consultant, Alex Dean. And we're going to talk about Greta Thunberg, because she's been in Bristol.
Yes, so she's been speaking at a rally in Bristol. Lots of teenagers and kids off school. I saw one poster, it's not in this, but of somebody who'd made it saying, we're skipping our lessons to teach the adults a lesson. And they'd spelled hour wrong, which suggested they might in fact do with some more lessons. But you know, there's plenty to criticise about both the school strike and the sort of some of the hysteria around this. The reality is that climate change is a very serious problem, and I think it's partly because of this young woman that there has been a transformation in public opinion about how important it is and how swiftly we need to act, and that's going to be really important when it comes to making the changes, which we are already making great progress on here in the UK, to the way our economy and our energy system work.
Do you mean that? Do you think that...
We're doing quite well.
No.
I think that she's made a difference. Yeah, I do.
Yeah, so that's what I want to test, because I think, after all of the science and all the political concern about it, you think this slightly culty exploitation of this young woman is what's made this the front page issue that it is?
I think partly yes, because she and Extinction Rebellion attract a lot of attention and opprobrium and debate,
Sure.
and so it just increases the salience in a way, whereas a conversation where everybody just agrees and talks about science somehow doesn't quite cut through.
But you also, I think it's... I find myself weirdly semi-defending Greta Thunberg here, because you've elided between her and Extinction Rebellion, and I think extending the salience was your polite way of putting it. I just saw the idiots from Extinction Rebellion trying to smash up the London Stock Exchange as I went through Paternoster Square today. I don't think they advanced their cause positively. She does seek to advance her cause positively, so I distinguish between the two. But the world is not on fire as she declares it to be, and her climate change alarmism goes down, in my view, very badly in a country that's done more to reduce its carbon footprint than any other country in the G20. And we see a situation where we have declined to put a third runway at Heathrow. The Chinese are going to build hundreds more airports in their country alone. The Indians are going to pollute an enormous amount. And yet I cannot help but notice she goes around to rather pleasant, wealthy Western nations to preach her message, where she's very well received. If she really means this, she and her cults can go off and preach it in a place where they'll be rather hostilely received.
Just a quick word on that. Do you think that's fair, and saying that they're cultists, or are they just people who believe that climate change is a very real problem?
I think
they just back her message?
They're people who believe and who find her inspiring. There are a group of people who find her very upsetting, but there are lots of people who find her inspiring, and I think that political activism should be celebrated. But of course, we cannot tackle climate change unless we also deal with China and India. We are hosting a summit.
Okay, this lot are 2 stages off of acquiring some big campus somewhere and locking themselves in for the millennium. It's a weird movement.
Okay, well, let's move on, because we've only got about 30 seconds. So, and we want to talk about an extraordinary device, is that right?
Yeah.
It's at the Times. This is about monitoring your heart.
Great story. It's a little device that's been implanted in this chap. Not only can it deliver electric kind of impulses to his heart to correct problems with its rhythm and so forth and improve his health, but it can send messages to his doctor to let him know how it's going on. I love the idea of your patient's heart texting you.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, medical technology just gets better and better, but also more expensive, so.
Okay, well, we are out of time, but Alex and Polly, always good to
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.